So, I mean, to start off with, I'll get you to introduce yourself and what you do. But it will also be interested to know how how you can relate the historical significance of the breed into today's world and indeed the future of farming. Will I start with the other end, John, or do you want to go off first?
I'll give it a go.
Okay.
Hello everybody, my name's John Bennett and I have a 25-acre smallholding just south of Perth where I breed Cleveland Bay horses and Zwartblay sheep, which is a strange combination but works pretty well, especially on the grazing side. The 25 acres are all permanent grass and the horses and sheep manage it really well together. So there's no rough grazing because the sheep and the horses both take different parts and so manage the grazing really well. One thing with the grazing Cleveland Bay horses, like quite a few native breeds, is if you leave them with too much grass, you'll end up with fat, unproductive horses. So, but that's sort of quite common in native breeds. They're very good doers. What I do with my horses is I breed them, which is really important for Cleveland Bays. They're critically endangered. Worldwide, there is usually less than 30 foals, and that's from Australia, Canada, America, Japan, not too many in Eastern Europe, but 30 foals. Now, the crucial point, as Christopher and most of us are aware, is about 50 filly foals per year, or you're in a steep decline. So, a large part of the breeding the Cleveland Bays is to get every productive female to produce a foal, and to try and do it yearly, which is almost impossible. There are roughly 310 females of pregnancy age in the world. So there may be more, but they're not on our registers. So, and despite every society, the American Society, Australian Society, trying to capture these figures, there's always going to be some that slip through. But 300 is not a lot, and as I say, usually less than 30. Now, the decline in Cleveland Bays is historic. The society was founded in 1884 to try and bolster the numbers of horses at that point because they were degenerating. And since then, you've had the internal combustion engine, which has destroyed the usefulness of just about every native equine breed. So what do we do to make these horses viable? Christopher will no doubt come up with a few things like conservation grazing and stuff like that. Most pony breeds are quite good at that. The Cleveland Bay, I would say, has a different job in that the criteria of breeding Cleveland Bay is to put more Cleveland Bays on the ground. So it's an intense thing that should be going on to double, treble the numbers. So what we look for is every female to have a breeding job and every male to be a publicity thing. In the past, Cleveland Bays were bred, shown, and that was it. Further back, they go from being pack animals to carriage horses to light agricultural horses. All these jobs are no longer available. Until the price of diesel goes even more astronomical, horses are not going to be a viable option for commercial farming. There are plenty of people who use them in niche markets like logging. I was talking to a girl who was looking to buy Cleveland Bays for of all things, a ski resort in France, because the excuse me, the mountain restaurants now are supplied either by piston bullies using diesel or helicopters using kerosene at vast amounts and polluting the areas. And ski resorts are now becoming more conscious of the green market. So she was looking to buy Cleveland bays to pull sleds up to the mountain restaurants. And I said, good luck with that. And put her in touch with a few people I know that had sort of appropriate animals. But that is a very niche market. And the other niche market that everybody knows about is royal transport. Now, you're not going to get too many horses required for that, so it's not really a long-term option, sort of thing. Though the support of the royal family has been fairly intense and good under the old Queen. We're yet to see what our current king will be like, but I'm sure he will be supportive. But from the Cleveland Bay breed, niche markets are not what we want. We want to compete with our geldings and our partbreds in the leisure market and publicise the breed as a good option for leisure horse, which will ensure that the breeding population can continue in some way. Sorry, I've waffled on quite a bit. I'll probably better hand over now, but in the question and answer session, I'll be happy.
Well, hang on. I'm going to ask you one thing now. I mean, the fact that you've got the Cleveland Bay with its history, with everything that goes along with it, and the fact that it is a carriage horse primarily, that was really what it was designed to do. Does it have a role within? Do you see it having a role within, even within agritourism, for instance? Is it a, because it's a bonny horse, isn't it? I mean, it looks good.
Well, I think that agritourism in Scotland would be unusual because it's not a native breed, and tourists want to see Highland cows and Clydesdales, and there are a few people doing it. The guy that was meant to be coming here, Bennett, Duncan, has a Clydesdale experience. There's another great one on the Ayrshire coast, Blackford Clydesdales. There used to be Beamish Museum in Durham, which had Clydesdales, not Clydesdale, Cleveland Bays as part of their history and farm museums, and they bred a lot and stuff like that. Thank you very much. So yes, there is a market for agricultural tourism, but I think it's fairly small and can be filled by quite a small number, which is not what we're concentrating on, which is bulking up numbers.
Okay. All right, thanks, John. Right, I'm going to hand on to Steve now, and he's going to tell us all about ponies, in particular the Eriskay.
Hi, thank you. As Martin said, in addition to being an RBST trustee, I'm also chair of the Eriskay Ponies Society. So whilst Martin's maybe hoping I'm going to speak about native ponies in general, it's going to be very focused on the Eriskay. For those of you who didn't know, the Eriskay pony is quite often called the last remnant of Scotland's native horse. It was the island pony. All the crofters had them. They were small, hardy, agile, very clever, and they performed all the tasks on the small farms in the croft, especially on the west coast. They're quite often called the back door pony because that's where they spent most of their time, standing at the back door, probably waiting to get in. They brought the peat down from the hills. They brought the seaweed up from the beach. They took the children to school. They were absolutely essential for these small crofts. As mechanisation came in, and as the ponies on the mainland were needed to be bigger and stronger, they were crossed with other things. to give bigger, stronger ponies for working on the smaller farms. On the west coast, especially on the small islands, you couldn't get near the place because there was no bridges, there wasn't the ferry network there is now occasionally. So that the breed remained pure on Barra and mostly on Eriskay. At one point in about 1970, the islanders realised that the breed was in desperate straits. There was about 20 ponies left in the world, and they formed a society on the island to preserve the pony, and started getting it better known, getting the numbers up. There's also a society on the mainland now, which is the one I'm the chair of, and we look at promoting the pony throughout the UK, showing everybody what a wonderful pony it is, able to do so much, very clever, very switched on. They won't do things that they think is stupid, so you have to convince them that it was their idea in the first place, in which case they are fantastic working ponies, very people friendly. The Eriskays we've got, I'm up in Aberdeenshire, and as John mentioned about natives being on very lush grass, we have to be very careful that the ponies don't get too much grass. When we started using these fields, when we got them sown, there's no ryegrass whatsoever. It's very unimproved land. We run it as a track system in that we've got some fields in the middle that are separated by electric fencing, and then round about the entire ground we've got a track about 10 metres to 20 metres wide that we just let go absolutely wild. And if the ponies had a choice, they would be out on that all the time. When they're on the better, when I say better grass, slightly better grass, we strip graze them because of the risk of laminitis if they eat too much high sugar stuff. But out on the track, what they would prefer to eat, they love willow, birch, they dig up thistles. Because they prefer them slightly wilted, the ponies will go and dig them up and then wander off and come back a few hours later when they're slightly wilted and eat them then. The nettle roots, couch grass roots, the willow herb, cow parsley, all the rough grazing is what they prefer. What we do quite a lot is we leave areas totally alone all summer, let all the wild grasses come up and seed, and then in the winter we'll let the ponies into that area. They trample down the dead grass, making a much better bed for wildlife and for grasses to grow, and then they just chew on what they like. I say willow especially, for some reason they absolutely love willow, and where we've planted willow and need to keep it coppiced and cut down, we throw the branches into the ponies, and they'll eat the leaves first, but then they will strip the bark off what's left. They just, I don't know whether it's a taste or what, but they really love that kind of grazing. They do have uses in today's equine world. They're used quite a lot as, or have been used in the past, as therapy ponies because they're very people oriented, very switched on, and they understand that if somebody's not confident, they will look after them. They do a lot of, they have done logging. When my wife started riding our first Eriskay, which we only got as a companion, and this is a warning really, we started off with one and now we've got 8. We got it as a companion, but when her riding horse retired, she thought she'd better use the Eriskay for something, so she started riding him and found that for a small pony had absolutely fantastic paces. She keeps on saying it's like being on a bigger, stronger horse, very forward going, very solid ride, and she used him for endurance rides, treks. He did dressage, and he also went to some shows, although that was never just her favourite thing. So a very versatile pony, available. You can use them for absolutely anything, as long as you convince them that it's a good idea. What you won't be able to do is force them, and that's the same with quite a few natives. Very intelligent, very people orientated, but they have to think it's their idea. You can't take them like some of the thoroughbreds and say we're going to do this and that's it. you really have to convince them to be involved. And they love a job to do. They much prefer doing something rather than standing around. And if you go into the field and do anything, you always do it with a pony looking over your shoulder. And if you put something down, they're likely to pick it up and go and play with it. So, like a lot of natives, very clever, switched on, but you have to be on their wavelength, and that's really important. I think Christopher's actually going to cover conservation grazing, so I'll leave him with that. But natives are what we should be using on the landscapes around us. That was the landscapes that formed them, and they formed these landscapes. So they're the kind of ponies that should be out there doing the job that they were actually bred for.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. I'm just going to ask the question of both of you, actually. Because one of the things to talk about is the inputs you have to make. And I know your view on horses with rugs on and things like that, John. But in terms of the Cleveland Bay, in terms of the Eriskay, in terms of their general maintenance, if you like, that you have to put in, so the inputs that you have to make. How do those compare to, shall we say, thoroughbreds or whatever else, or riding ponies?
Let's start with the Cleveland Bay. The Cleveland Bay is said to thrive on a view and fresh air, which is about standard. I don't feed any hard feed until late pregnancy, the last semester, for mares, and none of the rest of them get it, and they're certainly never rugged. They would stay outside 24 hours a day, but I'm on heavy clay, so I bring them in at night, both to save the fields a bit, which is impossible, but to get their feet to dry out. They'll grow coats like bears. You'll see them with an inch of snow on their backs because they're so well insulated. In fact, if you put them out in snow, the first thing they do is dive into it like pigs, roll and grout it all up and stuff like that. So they're very capable of, in the right conditions, staying out 24 hours, 365 days a year. And grass, that's all you need, and very little of it. I make my own hay, and that does both the sheep and the horses. The sheep require more feeding than the horses. They will live on fresh air, basically. But I'm sure it's much the same as most native. My only excessive input is vet bills, because I breed, so I need to scan and test, and that's where the majority of the vet bills go. But they're very strong. Like all natives, they were born to be in this climate and be hardy.
Yeah, I would agree with what John said. Our Eriskays, we have no means of bringing them in. We don't have stables or anything, but we've got field shelters where they are. And the only time they go into them is when it's hot sunny days and they go in to get out of the sun. They would much rather be out in the snow, in the wet, and we've seen them in some of this horrendous weather we've had lately, standing, howling gale, pouring rain. All they do is turn their bum to the wind and they're perfectly happy. Their coat is waterproof. If you go up, especially through the winter or at any time, and put your hand in and shove it under the guard hairs, they're absolutely warm and dry against their skin. We don't rub them. They just please themselves. As John said, they love to roll, usually in mud, especially if you've got them clean for a minute or two. So they all turn up the same colour, which makes it awkward to tell which is which from a distance. We do breed a few foals, and the mares occasionally get an extra, some minerals. There's usually salt licks available, but they foal out in the field. The first time we know a foal's due, and usually at early morning my wife will wander around the corner and phone back and say the foal's arrived, and it's just in the field. They don't get brought in to foal at all, and we've had quite a few foals and they've all just been like that. They've just arrived through the night and they've been standing there in the morning. Very low input, no extra feed. As I said earlier, the main thing is stopping them eating rather than trying to feed them. And if they get the choice, they will go out onto the roughest grass, the roughest area, and nibble around there rather than stand in the rich stuff. Not that we have any rich stuff, but certainly the rougher grazing is where they're happier. They're very selective what they eat. As I said earlier about digging up the thistles, but they also like various seed heads of something like cow parsley and willow herb, and just nibble a bit off the top. So you go into the field and there's all these stems of cow parsley left, and all the seed heads have gone, which is fine because it saves it taking over, and it's just a fine balance that they do the maintenance and the management of the rougher areas for us, and we get a much better sward of mixed grazing, which is fantastic for our wildlife. You know, our fields are full of butterflies and beasties and badgers and pheasants and goodness knows what, because of the long areas of grass that we're able to leave. And when it does get trampled down, it then gives other species a good chance of growing because the old grass has been trampled.
Okay, another question.
Are you going to ask me a question, or should I just...
No, I was hoping you were going to talk about conservation grazing now.
Okay, well, before I do that, can we just go back to the, I think, first principles, the bigger picture. Our native equine breeds, as is the same with our native livestock breeds, originally came into being to meet our needs in our climate, on our habitats, in our landscape, and in our altitudes. You know, that they are meant to be here to do various things for us. You know, with livestock, it's about providing us with food and clothing. With equines, it was much to do with transport and moving, but the principle remains the same. I think there's a number of implications of that. The first, on which we've already touched on, the first is on the input side, that they don't need very much in the way of inputs. As John was saying, they can live outside on, what was it, grass and a view?
Fresh air and
a view, sorry, yes. Which is great, and distinguishes them from many of the continental breeds, which obviously weren't bred to be here. As a result, the costs of keeping them can be negligible. I mean, John breeds, and that will incur costs, but just keeping them more generally, the costs are negligible. Once you've got the land and the animals, that's pretty much it, as you'd expect from something that was bred to be here. Perhaps the more challenging side is the other side of the equation, which is the use. You know, we've heard all about the various uses of Eriskays in servicing crofter populations, and you could say similar things about all of the other breeds. And as we've heard, the challenge is that a lot of those uses no longer exist. But if we're going to get the breeds back to where we would want them to be, then we do have to start identifying those uses and getting the breeds back in there. It's of course true that what John says, that the initial stage is to ensure that we have populations that are of a sufficient size and genetic diversity, but once you've got beyond that stage, it's finding the uses, it's a challenge. I think most of you will know that each year in RBST we produce the watch list, which is an appraisal of the conservation status of each of our native livestock and equine breeds, and for that we use a traffic light system. If it's green, it means pretty much everything's okay. If it's orange, it means numbers are declining. If it's red, it means numbers are declining, or if not declining, numbers are worrying. But if it's red, it's both numbers are worrying, but also there is a concern about the level of inbreeding. And so the intention should be at least to go and get them off the red, where inbreeding isn't such an issue, and start focusing on numbers instead. And the way you do that is by finding uses. I don't think I'm as pessimistic about the challenge of finding uses as perhaps the other two speakers have been. There does seem to be more of it. I mean, we're not going to go back to replacing cars with horse-drawn carriages, of course, but there are, it seems to me, more people finding uses for equines. Now, we've heard about logging, forestry, and they are, my impression, and this is all impressionistic, it's not based on data, is that there are more equines being used in forestry and land management type of operations, because often the costs of the four-wheeled kit can be so prohibitively expensive. It makes sense to use the horse that was bred to do the job. Forestry is the most obvious, but also in-game management, bringing shot deer off the hills. Ponies are good for that, and similar things. And also one thing which we haven't touched on at all is competitions and showing. I'm conscious that both of those can be problematic. Both of those can result in animals which may lose some of their utility if the breed standard isn't right, or if the way that showing is conducted isn't right. But it can be a way of increasing numbers. Carriage riding, which certain other breeds are used for, like hackneys, for example, can also be a way forward. So I think that the potential is there. As John says, all of these might be niche, but my thinking is if we can identify enough niche things, then it starts to reach a certain level where it can have a utility. But as has been said on several occasions already, although the animals may have come into being to meet our needs for transport and the like, increasingly their utility is in conservation grazing. And at RBST we've seen quite a lot of this being done. I think we all want to go and conserve our pasture land, our meadows, etc. And if we're doing that, then what better to use than the breeds that created those in the first place through their grazing habits? And the more we recognise that, and the more we recognise that each of the breeds will have its own, I don't want to overstate this, but each of the breeds will have its own niche in grazing. They will each do different things. Then a more sophisticated grazing regime should be able to identify which is the appropriate breed to use for a particular job. So I think we'll see more of that. And as we see the new agri-environment schemes being rolled out across the 4 UK countries, then the incentives start to go and be there. In England, where, as you've probably gathered I'm from, things are further ahead in what the new schemes will look like, but there are payments there for grazing which apply to equines in the same way as they apply to livestock breeds. And I would hope that the same is rolled out in Scotland. It's not quite as clear from legislation that the powers can be used for equines, but on the face of it, it seems they can, and we're working with Scottish Government to get that clarified. So I think that the scope is there. So to sum up, first of all, we do need to be concentrating on breeding to ensure that we have a certain critical mass of numbers and that they are sufficiently genetically diverse, because the two go together in terms of assuring the future. But after that, we need to be doing all we can to go and demonstrate to a wider audience as possible the uses of the various breeds. But I'm reasonably optimistic that that's not an unachievable task. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks very much, Christopher. Right. Chance for questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah. Just following on from what Chris was saying just now about utility and conservation grazing. The reason I've come to this talk is because I'm faced with the challenge of returning productivity to upland country which has been overused by sheep in the past. And the selective grazing of sheep is a problem that's affecting huge swathes of the British uplands. And I'm very interested in the use of horses as bringing an alternative impact into the grazing regime to start to redress that historical balance and return that productivity to that country. So what I'm interested in to hear from you guys is one, whether or not I'm shaking the right end of the stick by even thinking this way, and I think some of what you've said addresses that already, and I'm already feeling positive about it. But also, what kind of management regime might suit small native equines in terms of preventing laminitis and etc. And again, I think you've already said something which is guiding my thinking. But if any of you would like to just address my thoughts around this, around how and if small native equines can be used to get rid of the coarse grasses that are taking over in over-sheeped uplands.
Is it on hills? Are you on hill?
Yeah, hilly ground primarily. That's right. Yeah, and then if you could just talk to that a little bit, I'd be grateful.
Sorry, John.
Yeah, I didn't want to give the impression earlier on that you have to keep native ponies off of grass altogether, it's keeping them off the wrong kind of grass. You know, that there's native pony populations on Dartmoor and Exmoor that sort themselves out and eat rough grasses, you know, the Melina and rush. You know, ponies seem to love rush for some reason. So they will certainly eat that kind of stuff. And if they've got enough room to be free roaming, then they will, by nature, wander around eating little bits of different things. So it's the grass I was talking about keeping them off of is the rye grass, fertilised with nitrogen, the farmer's fields kind of grass that you would have in the lowlands, and there would be put sheep on and stuff like that. If they're left on their own to choose, then they're likely to want to have a nibble of everything rather than stand and fill their bellies with one particular thing.
And would they repair? Do you think they wouldn't? I mean, I think the chaps wanted to know if they would repair the damage that sheep have done. Do you think?
Well, the stuff that the sheep would leave could well be palatable. I mean, it depends on your ground, but the stuff that the ponies will eat is not always the same as what the sheep would eat.
Exactly.
And it's not just changing the livestock; it's getting the numbers right. You know, it's having the right numbers of the right breed in the right place. And certainly on Exmoor and Dartmoor, I know that the native ponies there they use them to eat is it Melina? Is that the right name of the grass? Yeah. To allow the heather to regrow. So it does work. There is a herd of Eriskays on Holy Isle, just off of Arran. Now they were put on there 40 odd years ago and are totally untouched since. They're not handled at all. They're just left to get on with their own thing. And they regulate their own grazing. You know, the grass is there. They've been seen eating little bits of bracken, which is seen as toxic, but they're probably doing that to self-worm themselves. So given a wide enough range, they will eat little bits of things without ruining anything. And yet I think they can repair the damage because a lot of the stuff the sheep won't eat, the ponies will. Do you want to?
I agree with everything that Steve said, of course, but at the outset I noted that all of the breeds came into being because they met our needs in certain areas, that most breeds are tied to particular places. And I think that's quite a useful indicator in that Exmoor ponies are meant for Exmoor, Dartmoor ponies are meant for Dartmoor. And the fact that they've got the moor in their name suggests that they are perfectly adapted for moorland grazing. And as Steve says, they will both deal with Melina, which is one of the common problems. If I don't mention this, then I'm sure somebody else will, so I'm going to go in first. One of our particular bugbears is the increasing use of conic ponies for this job. I would hope that we're over the worst of that. For those who don't know, conic ponies come from Poland, and when rewilding first became a thing 20 odd years ago, it was thought that conic ponies were descended from the prehistoric tarpan. We now know that they're not, and there's no genetic connection at all. They just have a similarly shaped head, which is why people thought they were connected. But as a result, an awful lot of conics were used, first of all, in mainland Europe, rewilding or similar type projects, and have been used here as well at Wicken Fen in East Anglia. They've been used. And because of this sort of romantic history that they were falsely given, people thought they were the right thing to do, and then almost forced themselves into going thinking, and they were right ecologically as well. We've looked into this in significant detail, and firstly, as I said, the historical connection isn't there. Also, we don't see that they have any distinct grazing impact from our native ponies, and as I've already said, our native ponies created the habitats we're trying to conserve or recreate. But perhaps most importantly, if you look at where conics come from in Poland, you'll see it's a lot warmer and a lot drier than most of England, which makes us concerned that they really aren't adapted to being in our landscape to the extent that people have suggested they ought to be. I would hope now that if people were setting up conservation grazing regimes with ponies, they wouldn't at least automatically go to conics. They would think in a more rounded way and come up with more appropriate breeds to have. But there is still that issue. Part of it was that there was someone in Kent who bred vast numbers of conics, which meant that if you were looking for ponies for conservation grazing, you could get them pretty much on tap. That's now gone, so numbers being drawn up. But certainly the point is that if you're trying to create or restore our landscapes, then use the things that created them in the first place.
Sorry, do you want to come back?
One quick point.
I think he wants to just come back.
Sorry. Well, I was going to say, if you look on the RBST website, there is a blog that covers all of what we're pretty sure. There is a blog that covers all of what we collectively have been saying on this about the use of ponies in grazing regimes.
So, is there a pony for Dumfries and Galloway and the borders of Scotland which is available and relevant to the area?
Yes.
The traditional pony in Dumfries and Galloway is now extinct. The closest you're probably going to get to that is the fells. Fell ponies.
The fell ponies.
Yeah. They're of a similar stock. Also the Irish, there's an Irish breed, the Irish bog pony. Obviously the clue's in the title. If you're on high dry hill, you're probably looking at fells and dales, but any of the breeds would adapt to it. Highland, Eriskays, so Cleveland Bay is probably better suited to lower ground in that it's a great sod buster. It will tear up sort of farmer pasture, and it likes standing in water and eating the tips of the grass for some strange reason. So I think, but more wetland management and quickly converting an arable field to rough pasture. They will destroy an arable field in days, basically, if it's wet. There's a saying, there's only one thing goes into a field after a horse, and it's a plough. So they're great for sod busting. Being bigger, the smaller ponies, lighter on their feet, don't particularly do that. But if you're wanting instant ploughing, put a big horse in a wet field. So, okay.
Or a pig, of course. You would tell I'm a pig breeder, right? Yes, sir.
Would ponies respond to technology, just no fence collars, which we see in cattle?
Yeah, they do. We've got a member of our Eriskay Society that's got ponies in Argyll, a huge area of land, and he started off with Highland cattle and put collars on them, and he's got ponies there now, basically no fences, the ponies just go out. They'll stick to the area, they won't wander off. If there's enough to keep them interested where they are, they'll stay there, but they do respond to the electric warning collars that they have. I can't remember the proper name for it, but your ring fence your area. And GPS, yeah. That does work, because we've got folk doing that, yeah.
Thanks.
So I disagree. I thought that No Fence didn't recommend their collars for equines because when they're browsing, the branches can get caught between their heads and the collars, and there was a potential welfare issue.
I hadn't heard that, but it depends on the ground. If there's no branches, it's...
Maybe that's it.
So the question is, so the answer is it works, but there might be a welfare issue, so we're going to have to look at that. Sorry, yes.
I'm just interested in the water requirements for ponies in comparison to a cow, for example.
Like you
Cleveland Bay is roughly equivalent to a large cow, and the water requirements are fairly similar. Whereas grey sheep, and they will take most of the moisture from grass. Horses and ponies do need a fresh supply of water, and you're then into the controversy of using natural sources of water like burns and everything, do they pollute it and stuff like that? But it's something that's got to be thought of. Sort of thing. I wouldn't imagine if you're far out on a hill that they're going to be that damaging. But I have seen cases where horses and ponies restricted to drinking out of a burn will damage the sides of the burn going down to it. Same as cattle, and it's now illegal for cattle to do something. So, but it's roughly the liquid requirement for a large horse like Cleveland Bay is closely approximate to a cow.
Do you know of a lot of forestry extracting timber with ponies and horses in Scotland at the moment?
I'll answer first of all. I know that there's people doing it with Clydesdales. There's somebody using a Dales as well to do that in the forest down both south of here. Where else, John?
I know of a Belgian heavy mare that's being used in that. I wouldn't imagine there's more than about a dozen operations going on around Scotland. That's about. There used to be some Aberfeldy, I think, used a pair of Clydesdales, but is no longer doing it. So it's usually down to one man and his contacts, and as people get older they retire and leave a gap for somebody. There's certainly not a huge amount at the moment, but with the ecosystem sort of prevalence now, people are more aware of it, and putting a equivalent to a Death Star into a forest and destroying it is logical for commercial uses. But I think in the future there will be more opportunities, but again I'm not sure that's enough to sustain populations. As Christopher says, we've got to look for other links, tourism and anything that a horse can do. And remember, horses did everything up until the start of the 20th century. So it's not the horses that are missing, it's the skills and the economic opportunity.
How much skill is it to train a horse to be happy and to be comfortable with logging?
I mean, as Steve said, horses are intelligent animals, and they need to be engaged, and you do need to keep them. You need to keep them in that process. So I think if you are, anyone who is ploughing with them, I think you often see people doing, they'll still have them pulling, during the off season. So that, during the winter they'll be, once they're done with the ploughing, they'll be out doing other stuff, just to keep them engaged and keep them, in my limited experience of sort of horses and ponies, I think that's the thing I would say. They just need to be kept. They need to be kept interested. Do you not think?
Yeah, a horse needs a job to do, or they become bored rapidly. And what we do is we start training the foal when it hits the ground, because it's going to work with humans, it's going to be looked after by humans, so it may as well get on with humans and realise they're not a danger or something they've got to run away from. So the training is ongoing all the time. The natural age of a horse to start working likely would be about 4, but you're doing all sorts of training beforehand. And I found with natives, they're very bright, pick up things and enjoy it. So you'll have that training going on from a foal all the way through, gentle stuff, nothing serious, and about 4 they're powerful enough to take on a job. And they will learn a job within 6 months, harness and pulling. And harness and pulling is the principle of all the rest of the things. Once they're confident in that, it's only experience of putting them into different situations. So they're not difficult to train. You've got to know what you're doing. Taking somebody off the street and say, train a horse, it's not going to happen. But there are procedures, and you can buy trained horses for particular jobs. Though for like logging, it's unlikely. It was probably more likely the guy's got a horse, trained it himself, and has been doing it for a while. So the basic problem is training the people to work the horses, which is skills that long lost. And everybody used to do it, because that was how people got about. The supply chain for cities, for thousands of horses, we no longer have that. Horses are pets now.
Sorry, just to take that point, part of it is because native ponies in particular are very people ponies. They form a bond with their owner, they get comfortable, they trust you as their owner, and therefore if there's a job that you're trying to train them for, they're very quick to learn because they trust you. Just to give you an example, one of our mares, we wanted to train her to use the traditional creels as they used on Eriskay, so that we could do displays at RBST events and stuff like that. And we got some advice from folk, it'll take, put on hay nets and do a little bit. Well, with that pony, because we knew her and you trusted her, on day one we put the mat on her and she was absolutely unfazed by that. Day two we put the wooden saddle on and she couldn't care less. And day three we put the creels on and started walking her around the field. But that was because she knew us and that she was comfortable with us, and she was happy that we weren't going to do anything that would cause her a problem. So whether that would last if we then started trying to take seaweed off the beach, I don't know, but we certainly got her walking through the field with creels within a few days. So they are very quick to learn because they're confident and they trust you.
The best way to manage a grass paddock for species diversity and soil health. Is there a good way with one horse?
Get another horse. And I'll sell you one if you want.
That's what I was about to say, that one is not, it's not the best way to keep horses. As a warning, I will say that we started off with one Eriskay and we've now got 8. Or we had 8 when I came down here. I'll wait and see when I get home. But they're better in groups.
Yeah.
You notice I said group, not 2.
Specifically the grass management for the species and the soil improvement. How can you work with the soil and work with the horse to increase your species diversity? That's really what I'm asking.
It's really just a case of not overgrazing. So they've got access to a variety of stuff. If you restrict them onto one small area, they'll eat everything in sight, and they will then eat things that you don't want them to eat. Whereas if they've got a choice, they'll wander around.
Eat everything.
Sorry?
They'll still eat everything.
They'll still eat everything, but when we use a track system, they can go around a 3-acre field with a track around it. So when they go in there, they wander round the entire track. They'll nibble a wee bit here and there, and then move on to something else. So there's no area getting absolutely ruined, but everything's getting the benefit of getting topped or trampled or droppings left, shall we say. I'm trying to think of a polite way of saying that, and suddenly discovered I couldn't find the word. But yes, and the hoof prints, especially with ponies, aren't. When John was speaking about the bigger horses ploughing up a field, ponies with smaller hoof prints aren't damaging the soil, even if it's wet. I mean, there will be tracks that they'll make within long grass that they'll always follow, but that's useful as well.
It depends on how much land you've got, but if you can seal off, split the paddock and reseed. And there's plenty of commercial seed houses that will, if you talk to them and say what you want, they will advise you. And if you can just scarify and scatter a few ounces of seed here and there, and let it establish 2-3 months if you've got enough, and then put the horse back on, do it with another one, sort of thing. It's amazing what you will get coming through. When we first moved in, we had a lot of rushes and buttercups and stuff like that, and they destroyed that pretty quickly. No rushes, and it's amazing in the spring just what comes through. So, but you've got to manage it. You can't let them just, as Steve says, just park them in too small a space. They will just devastate it, and you'll just end up with that and nothing coming through. Sorry, man.
Okay, if there's nothing else, then we will wrap up. If you'd be so kind as to show your appreciation for the expert panel.